This is Talkish. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at hallicasser-jayne.com. Let's get to it. Today on episode 317 of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, I bring you a conversation with New York Times culture reporter and author of a phenomenal new biography of the late, great actor-comedian Robin Williams, appropriately titled Robin, Dave Itzkoff. And as always, stick around for my commentary at the end of the show. We've got a lot to get to, so let's. If life is an improvisation, and it is, no one improvised his life and maybe death more creatively than the brilliant tour de force that was comedian Robin Williams. In his new devastating biography, Robin, New York Times cultural reporter Dave Itzkoff delivers a fever-pitched riff into the life that was Williams. When Robin dies suddenly in August of 2014 at the age of 63, his passing stunned millions of people in the United States and around the world. His shocking death not only raised questions about how and why it had happened, but also prompted reassessments of his extraordinary life and career. Illuminating both the man and the performer, Itzkoff draws on more than 100 interviews with Robin's family, friends, and colleagues, as well as with his own encounters and interviews with Williams over the years. Williams' friends were a who's who of the entertainment business, and their names crop up throughout the book. Billy Crystal, David Letterman, Pam Dawber, Dana Carvey, Eric Idle, Jeff Bridges, to name just a few. Besides being a culture reporter at the New York Times, where he writes regularly about film, television, theater, music, and popular culture, Dave Itzkoff is the author of Mad as Hell, Cocaine's Son, and Lads. He previously worked at Spin, Maxim, and Details, and his work has appeared in GQ, Vanity Fair, Wired, among others. Hold on to your hats. We're off on a wild ride as we explore the life and untimely death of the late, great, brilliant Robin Williams, with the author of Robin, David Itzkoff. Let's talk. So listen, Dave, I want to start with you, right? Because you're fascinating. Tell us a little bit about your work and how you came to really, in a way, befriend Williams. I mean, you were more than, just people who do work together. You became friends.
I don't know if I would go that far. He was certainly very kind to me, I think, in a way that I found out later. He was kind to a lot of people. He was the sort of person that I think if he could offer you a little bit of something out of his day that was easy for him, but that he knew would be memorable for you, that he was happy to do that. And I think he sort of knew the importance of it. I got to write about him on a few different occasions for the New York Times, and I think at greatest length there was a profile that I did of him at the end of 2009 when things were, I think it was a tough time for him because just a couple of years earlier he had a relapse into alcoholism and had gone into rehab to get sober, which is something he had never done before, and then that led to a really heartbreaking divorce for him. His second wife, Marcia, who he'd been married to for 20 years and was really integral in both his life and his career. And then he tried to start this tour that, it was really the first time he'd gone on the road in a while, and then he started having heart problems and had to basically put the whole tour on pause because he needed to have valve replacement surgery and then had to recover from that before he could get back on the road. And so that was basically all the backdrop to when I was writing about him and spending time with him. And I was just a little bit fearful that to have to ask him about some of those things, and would he want to discuss any of it? None of those were easy matters for anybody, and certainly, as you know, I mean, with people of celebrity and renown, they can be very guarded. They don't necessarily want to share that sort of side of themselves. But he was quite the opposite, that he was not only very open in the stand-up show, which took on a lot of those experiences, but just in talking to me about what had happened, certainly with the alcoholism relapse and being in rehab, and I think on his part, understanding how he'd hurt a lot of people in his life by how he'd behaved when he was under the influence, and knowing why he needed to get clean and why his previous efforts at getting sober hadn't worked, and just all of that. And again, it was so candid and right. So just sort of, really just on the table in a way that people tend not to be, that really left an impression with me.
So two things here. One is he's a mensch. There's
Yes.
Right? Isn't that the perfect word?
Absolutely.
For who this guy was. And, you don't
even for a goy, you can call him a mensch. Yes.
You got it, darling. I'm the same tribe as you. Right. I get that. Right? He gets it. It's great. But so if you go there and we say that, but what was your, going back to that first time that you met him, and, and yes, we'll talk about what other people think about him and his friends, but you as meeting him as the reporter, walking in, kind of a young guy to his older. But I'm saying to you, what's your first impression? Can you remember that first meeting and what your first thought?
Even before we had that first face-to-face encounter, I had done at least one phone interview with him because he was involved in a story that I did about a movie that he starred in for his friend Bobcat Goldthwait. And I remember even in that conversation how sort of subdued and soft-spoken he was, and just very easy to talk to, certainly not on at all in the way that I think I expected him to be, just based on his performance style and his film roles. And he was very much like that in some of those first interviews, the face-to-face ones as well. But the very first one was in a hotel room, a 5-star hotel room in suburban Atlanta, and it was very late at night. He had just done a show at the Fox Theater, and all just very, very calm and quiet, and the lights were kind of low. And at one point he was telling me a story about his late mother, and the lights started to flicker, and then he kind of went into a bit pretending that like it was his mother trying to contact him from the beyond. What is it, oh spirit? And so he could be like that even in a one-on-one interaction, he would sometimes slip into a bit or a character, or do some jokes for you to sort of put you at ease. But I think that also put him at ease a little bit, that when he was around people he didn't entirely know, and even people he did know, that it made him comfortable just to be telling jokes. It was a way of protecting himself too, I think.
You did enormous research for this book. It's extraordinary. Here's my question though, right?
Sure.
Who did you not speak with that you wish that you had?
Well, certainly I think it was challenging for various members of his family who were, I think are still grieving for him, and even 4 years later, it's still a very palpable loss for them. And so I did get to speak, for example, to his son Zach, and to his first wife Valerie, and to he has a half brother who's passed away a few years ago, but a surviving half brother, McLaurin, who spoke to me. So all those folks I was grateful to have. Understandable that I think for other family members, he has 2 other children who are younger than Zach, and I think knew him a little bit differently. It's not easy to put yourself out there publicly. I'm sure that they still deal with a lot of things privately, and also can't really probably go a day without encountering a picture of their father, or just seeing him sort of out in the world in some way. They can't control that, and I can understand how that's probably still very can lead to a lot of discomfort and anxiety.
It's hard being the kid of a celebrity. It's hard being the relationship, or anybody connected to a celebrity, as much as it is being a celebrity. Unbeknownst to most, he came from an incredibly privileged background. Tell us about that, because I think that does play a role in who he became.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has a lot to do with just the person that he grew up to be, because we do often think about, I think, comedians as coming from backgrounds of adversity and hardship. And a classic example is somebody like Richard Pryor, who literally grew up in the brothels of Peoria, Illinois, and that was not Robin's upbringing at all. That his family was very wealthy, and his father his father had come from wealth and was a Ford executive, and the family was basically living in the suburbs of Illinois and Michigan, and living essentially in mansions, 30 and 40 room houses, which was just Robin and his mother and father. So all this space that they didn't need, and so they had servants, but they would just often big empty houses. And Robin's father traveled a lot for his work. His mother was essentially a socialite and very involved in social affairs and functions and parties. And though he loved both of his parents and they were involved in his life to a certain degree, I think they were also very absent from his life at times, and that he definitely noticed that loneliness and that solitude. And I think that those were feelings that stayed with him pretty much throughout his life.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. I have to tell you something. You're going to think I'm crazy, but I got to say it.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's all right. I don't mind being called crazy, by the way. Go for it. There's a picture in the book of his mother. Do you know the picture that I'm talking about?
Sure, the mother and father together.
That is the most haunting picture. I cannot keep going. I just want to keep going back and looking at it. It is so revelatory into who Robin is if you look at that picture. Now, anybody who's listening to this is not understanding what I'm saying. Only you and I know what the picture is that we're talking about.
I get what you're saying. That in a way, they really are the sort of the two halves of them. And if you put them together, because his father, was very reserved and certainly believed in the value of a hard day's work and the values of propriety, and Robin definitely had that side to him. And his mother was very vivacious and had a kind of a zany sense of humor of her own. There's a joke that she there's like a Dick Clark TV special that she and Robin were on together in the early 80s, and she demonstrates this practical joke that she loves, where basically she takes a rubber band and cuts it in half and kind of wads it up into a ball and puts it in one of her nostrils and then pretends to sneeze, so that she has like this long strand of a rubber band hanging out of her nose. And this is not, if you ever saw her, this is not the way you'd expect her to behave, but that's who she was, and that Robin, I think, took a lot away from that. That if that made her laugh, it was important to him to find a way to entertain her and his father in that way.
And it's interesting because when you see the diametrical opposites the mother and the father are, you really understand a lot of who Robin is. Who you so eloquently write about is the consummate performer and professional that people don't give him credit for. And you know that came from Daddy, clearly.
Well, I think he gets, I think to a certain extent, Robin gets a bad rap as a comedian who just sort of one day woke up and decided that he wanted to be a serious actor or be taken seriously as an actor. And he'd actually, trained for quite a while as an actor, and that was really his first love and passion, and not only studied for years at Juilliard, but at two other colleges where he got a lot of acting training. And, it was something that he was very sincerely committed to, and the comedy was something he kind of, in a way, fell into backwards, because it was only after he dropped out of Juilliard in the mid-'70s and came back to San Francisco, where his parents lived, and the city was having a kind of resurgence of stand-up, and that was something that he had an aptitude for. But had it not been for that, he could have found his acting roles right out of school. Maybe the stand-up would never have happened.
So true, so true. You brought up the loneliness. I want to talk about that because I think there's a sidebar to that. For all intent and purposes, it's fair to say that, he had a lonely childhood. His mother and father were traveling around, and she went with him. There's a great line in the book about her mother, why she went with the father. She didn't trust him. I love that.
Yeah. Well, she thought that the father was extremely, handsome and charismatic, which he was, and that could be threatening too.
No question about it. A smart woman. She married the right guy. But he appears to have been born with a vivid imagination. Robin.
I think so.
Right?
Yeah.
Something which can be both a blessing and a curse, being one of those people who was born with a vivid imagination. Spent a lot of my own childhood alone because my parents were doing what his parents were doing, running around. So I say to you about that, was it a blessing, this imagination for him? And I
think in some ways, it certainly can be both, and I think it offered him a lot of escape, which is good, and certainly he got a lot of time in his youth, and was able to sort of channel it into more positive activities. And when I talk about a hobby that basically he had all throughout his life was collecting toy soldiers, and even into adulthood he had toy soldier collections and loved collectibles and action figures and things like that. But as a kid, it was particularly important because he would just not only stage these massive battles in his attic or wherever he had space, but that he would give each of the soldiers a kind of a voice and a character and a personality. And so in a way it becomes a kind of like a laboratory to try out a lot of the tools that he would need as a performer and as a comedian. And so those were the positive aspects of it. Those are the ways that he was able to to use the alone time in constructive ways. That was the good part of it. The harder part was I think the lingering effects of the solitude, and that taking that feeling wherever he went, that once he left the attic or once he left the house, that he still could feel by himself, and that even around people that he knew, people that he cared about, there was still that a little bit of a block or something, in a way that he sort of kept them at bay.
Yeah, aloneness becomes a companion. It's hard to let other people in. He goes west to San Francisco. You bring this up, and he sort of bursts into this local prominence in San Francisco, and then down to L.A., of course, and stand-up comedy in the 70s. But talk to me about his sense of self. Did he know, and better yet, understand the gift that he had? Or did he struggle with his talent and his sense of identity? Yeah,
I think that's something that really, fluctuated throughout his life. That on the one hand, certainly he had co-stars, people like Pam Dauber, who he worked with on Mork and Mindy, who felt like they saw aspects of him where, in some ways, they thought he felt very certain that he was destined for some kind of greatness or fame. But by and large, people also saw him struggle with that not believing that he was as talented as other people made him out to be, or that that he deserved the accolades and the adulation that he got. There was a story that his half brother McLaurin told me from one of the last years of Robin's life, where they went out to a restaurant together, and after their waiter left the table, that Robin starts to basically say, well, what's the difference between me and this waiter? I got a few lucky breaks, but that's basically it. Otherwise, there's no reason why I should be where I am, and the waiter is where the waiter is. And that's kind of a very, that's a really sort of, I think, heartbreaking way for him to see himself, to still, after all those years, not believe in himself that way, or believe that he was deserving of what he accomplished. That's it's heartbreaking.
You get the sense that he was a humble guy in a not so humble business.
Yeah, that was certainly very, very rare to see, and just very empathetic, and just caring about other people, caring about the kinds of roles that he played, and wanting to play people that he also felt were themselves empathetic, that cared about their other characters in a story. I think it's to a certain extent why he gets kind of tagged as for making movies that were sometimes derided as treacly or emotional, but those were almost always characters that he genuinely cared about and felt a personal investment in.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that too, because I think that's key to who he is. I want to talk about improvisation.
Oh, sure.
Because that is such a specific art, and so few people do it and do it well. He got, when he went to Juilliard, he got thrown out of Juilliard, right? Because he did it too well.
Well, I think that was really him, I think, sort of chafing against a system that was, it was new at the time. He entered Juilliard in what was only the fifth or sixth year that it had been running, and when John Houseman was still in charge of it, and it was still fairly Darwinian, that they would just cut students every year who they didn't think were benefiting from the training anymore, or were going to go on to other things. But yeah, I think certainly as that was not necessarily the kind of training that one received at a school like that. I think he definitely wanted just more, just to try things that were different and not so rigid and codified. And so yeah, certainly in San Francisco, and then after that in Los Angeles, where improv was happening, and that really. Those were both environments that he thrived in, that he just really could go from bit to bit or from character to character in a way where you didn't have to have a kind of internal logic, that if you just wanted to drop one character and jump into another one, you just did it, and that's how it was done, and that really appealed to him.
Yeah. Wouldn't you have liked to spend like about 5 minutes? I think that's all I could probably take. Well, maybe a little bit more inside that brain of his and watch it skip across. It's like to me, he was like a rock. You throw that rock into the river, and skip it along, and he would just pick up pieces as he went along. Boom, 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 boom. Brilliant mind, absolutely extraordinary mind. You were listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guest today is New York Times culture reporter and author of a phenomenal new biography of the late great actor comedian Robin Williams, Dave Itzkoff. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern at hallicasser-jayne.com and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Be sure to find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find the Halli Casser-Jayne Show on your Alexa device, too. Listen, the drugs and the alcohol, the cocaine addiction, this, that, and the other thing. I want to talk about it. For a minute here, we'll pick it up at the end of the conversation too. But what was that? What was that about?
Well, I not to make excuses for how he behaved, but in some ways it was unavoidable. It was pretty ubiquitous, certainly in. But by the time he gets to Hollywood and is really having success with Mork and Mindy, that cocaine was so prevalent in that scene and among actors, and he was having a lot of success, and at least by his own account, it was not something that he often had to pay for, that he could just be hanging out with people or at a party, and it just got passed around and offered. And also it was just a drug that was not, at least at the time, stigmatized in the way that it is now, but also, as people probably remember this, that Robin was with John Belushi on the last night of his life, and learned the next morning that Belushi had died of an overdose, and that was a huge wake-up call, certainly for Robin, a realization for himself that he had to get clean. But it also shook up Hollywood, not only the understanding that this is dangerous and deadly and can be fatal to people, but that the realization that law enforcement was about to start taking it a lot more seriously too, and that it wasn't just going. People were not going to just be allowed to kind of trade it like currency, and that it wouldn't go noticed by by police and by the FBI. And so a lot of people really had to learn to clean up their act pretty quick or suffer the consequences.
Oh my God, I covered that. I think I told you off air.
Yeah.
So I love to go back whenever it's a Belushi thing. There I am sitting on this car listening to Daryl Gates wax ineloquent. By the way, oh my God, he was. He took that moment, boy, and he took that mic, and he went to town that day. I'll tell you. But everything did change after that in Hollywood. There was a lot of huge change. Two questions. I'm bouncing around. I'm playing Robin,
That's
I guess.
Okay.
And I'm playing Robin in my head.
Understandable.
And all these things I want to play with you. So let's go with the first one, which is, as long as we're talking about drugs and Belushi, I want to talk about friendships too. He had two great friendships. Well, one in particular, Chris, and then there was Belushi, and then there's a whole cast and crew around him, and a lot of them who died tragically, young, horrid deaths.
I think that certainly. I mean, with Reeve, who was injured terribly, in that horse riding accident in 1995, and who Robin stayed very close with, through all of that. Recovery and even when Reeve died after, many years after the injury, it was kind of a blow to Robin, that not that they thought that he would ever recover from the paralysis, but that they didn't, I don't think, realize that that he was at in that much peril still, and that there were other just other risks that he faced due to his injuries. That was a shock to Robin. The death of somebody like Richard Pryor, who had been a mentor to him, and also essentially died of a long and degenerative condition. That was very tough on him. To see those sort of in succession, all in the sort of early 2000s, there was a lot of death, a lot of friends that he lost. I think that definitely had an impact on him.
Hard. Jumping around again, Mork from Ork. Did he hate him or love him?
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways he understood that was, kind of the perfect role for him in a way, because it had, the character had an innocence and a naivete that I think, Robin shared in some ways, or could certainly channel. And because he was, so foreign to Earth, that gave Robin all the license to, improvise and play with the character and play characters within that character, which is something that he, really excelled at, that it was this kind of jumping off point for, all this ad-libbing and improvisation. But it's certainly the confinement of it became very clear just as, the show really took off in its very first season and became a top 10 hit. And, even on like his first comedy record on Reality, What a Concept, which is very adult, not really for the same audience as Mork and Mindy, but there's a moment on that record where Robin is calling out to his audience for, prompts for ad-libbing, for improvisation, and somebody calls out Mork. And you can immediately hear the change in Robin's voice when he hears that it was clearly something he couldn't shake, that everybody always expected him to be Mork, at least in that period, and that became a little overwhelming.
Extraordinary character in all of its different incarnations. If you go back and you look at him performing that, when somebody would say, give us, it morphed ever so slightly, along with him. I mean, he grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, this guy. All right, so the genius makes genius films. I don't care what anybody says. Okay.
Yeah, it took him, I think, a little while to find, the exact right, roles for him. But certainly by the time you get to, Good Morning Vietnam, which was really very carefully developed and crafted, for Robin and for his talents. I mean, that was a #1 hit, and that was an Oscar nomination. And, then he was off and running. That led to Dead Poets Society, to Awakenings, to The Fisher King, which are all, really some of his, just the, Aladdin. I mean, that's really sort of, the hottest streak that he ever had.
But let's talk this. Mrs. Doubtfire, Good Will Hunting, Patch Adams, even The Birdcage.
Yeah.
I'm going to use a word here you hardly hear anymore, but I'm going to use it. And the word is pathos. So few have it. So it's something that we used to have that I think people just don't have anymore. Maybe that's why our politics is the way that it is, because people aren't sympathetic anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So.
No, I think that's I think a character like the one that he played in Good Will Hunting, which was much later in his career, but that was not a role that he could have probably played until then, because it needed it's such a wounded character, and I think you need somebody who at that point has lived a bit, and who has if he hasn't experienced the exact kind of suffering that the character has been to, then can at least relate to it. I think that's not a character you can play until you're in your 40s and 50s, and have seen some ups and downs.
But I'm going to say to you, he had that ability even as a young man, and when you saw him as a young man, that was what was so intriguing about him. He could be as silly and as goofy and as funny and as erudite, or all the things that he was, and at the same time there was this thing on his face that because he always let his heart out. That was just this inner sadness that was there. And sadness is a funny word. That's why I use the word pathos, because sadness isn't always sad. It's humanity.
Yeah. I think in some ways, not that he was ever faking at it, but in some ways, I think earlier on in some of the characters, you find a way just to relate to it in the role. You just through thought about the character and empathy, and then I think later on, when you've actually had experiences like that you can draw on, then you can bring it out in yourself. You can channel, if not identical, then analogous experiences that you've had, and that's where the feeling for the character comes from. But you're right. I think you could always do it at different times.
Yeah, just that was part of the genius, I think. I'll tell you a story. I spent a night with him in an odd setting.
Interesting.
The Comedy Store. He was there for a fundraiser for Jerry Brown. They talked him into doing it. A whole bunch of people. This is true. This goes back to, I guess the Senate run. I was trying to remember. I was there with Richie Lewis, who I grew up with. We're old friends. And and Richard had brought, I say Richie, he'll freak. Richard had, I was just a young kid. He was much older than I was. Come with me to whatever. So it's late at night. And there is Robin, and he says he'll do like 2 minutes. I think Jackson Brown was there too. I can't remember who else was on stage. Robin comes in and just goes bonkers. And 10 minutes turned into 20, turned into 50, turned into over an hour and a half. And at the end of the gig, this guy is reeking in sweat. You know how he would get, right? The frenetic, the intensity, the danger, And then I say to myself, we're getting to the end of the story now. What went wrong? I'm looking back. This guy was so happy doing what he did. And he's gone.
Yeah.
What was the turning point? What?
Well, no. There's there was a lot of hardship and sadness, and we talked about it earlier. Certainly, in the the late 2000s. I think again that sort of progression from having the relapse and falling off the wagon, that was very hard on his family. That I think definitely precipitated the end of his second marriage to his wife, Marcia Garces, who was, as we talked about, very instrumental in his life and who had helped him not only with his day-to-day, but also, helped find him roles like Mrs-Doubtfire. That was a project that she really helped cultivate, and she cared deeply about the kinds of work that Robin was doing. That was a big loss for him, and the heart problems, that the heart surgery, that was a setback. And then, frankly, having a disease that wasn't really fully diagnosed or understood until after his death, degenerative brain disease that they identified posthumously as Lewy body disease or Lewy body dementia. That was something that he didn't even fully know about in his own lifetime, and that's not anything that you can't. At least at this point, we don't know of a way to sort of test for that in advance. And it's not anything that's curable, and that had just devastating effects on him in his last couple of years of life.
So sad, so incredibly sad. A couple of more things just to kind of put the finishing touches on all of this brilliance of yours.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. I want to talk to you about you and Robin. I'm going to go back to you and Robin. Shared interest in a point you make about Robin, which is probably true of most performers, by the way, maybe more so him. They give you everything, right?
Yeah.
They give you everything, but. And you talk about it in the book. With Robin, what do you think the but was? What was he holding back? Because he kept a part of him for him.
Yeah, that's what's so sort of hard to know and mysterious about him, because I think everybody that I spoke to described him in that way of feeling like they got a big portion of him, and even we're talking even about like ex-wives and children feeling that they got quite a lot of him, but still not everything, and there was always some piece of him that was inaccessible to them, and that could be different for different people depending on who they were, what their relationship to him was, but nobody felt like they got the entirety of him. And again, I think that goes back to maybe a certain insecurity about him, a certain fear of judgment, the idea that if he were to show somebody who he truly was in entirety, that he could be judged for that and rejected over it, and that he would find that very hurtful. I think that sort of dictated how he engaged with a lot of people, and again, even people that he was intimate with and loved and close to, that even those people had that kind of experience with him.
I also think there's another part to it. People who have that glitter, who that star thing going on. I think that people never can get enough. Even if they're giving you everything, you still want more from them.
Yeah,
it's
that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting twist on all of that. I did a book with on John Densmore, on
right.
And what's his name, and that was it at the end. Everybody just sucked him dry. There was nothing left. That's why he died so young, Morrison. So there's a legal conflict over the estate. What's that?
Well, that I think is largely done, but it was something that occurred, posthumously after Robin's death. That his 3 children, who he had by his 2 previous wives, and who were very close to him and close with each other, and who. A lot of his possessions, which they had a lot of sentimental attachments to, that was all laid out pretty clearly in Robin's will and some trusts that he had established for them. But because of the circumstances in which he died, that he died in the house that he had essentially promised to his 3rd wife, the woman who became his widow, and so a lot of the possessions were still in the house at that time, and so there was almost immediately conflict. The widow sort of it didn't ever actually go to court, but there were a lot of fast and furious papers that were exchanged, legal filings that the widow trying to see, like, actually, do I get to keep this? Do I get this? And that was pretty. It was definitely hurtful to the children, and definitely was a big schism in the family. Really kind of exposing, I think. There was certainly no love lost between the children and the widow, who I don't think they felt ever really tried to integrate herself into the rest of the family or embrace the children as people who were entitled to a part of their father's life. And that was very hard. That whole legal, conflict was very hard on them, the children.
The wives came and they went. The kids were very important to him. Childhood was important to him. I love the quote you begin the book with, by the way. The creative adult is the child who survived.
Yeah.
I'd like to think of him right now, up in his little attic, playing with his toys and having a great time.
Yeah, I think that says a lot about who he was, who he became, who he always was through it all. I think that those were very formative times for him.
Hey, Dave, thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Enjoyed. I've been speaking with Dave Itzkoff, the author of an exhaustive new biography of the late great actor-comedian Robin Williams, Robin, available at fine bookstores everywhere. And now, a few words from me. There are few who would argue that Robin Williams was one of the great talents of his generation. He was a brilliant comic, a phenomenal actor, according to his biographer Dave Itzkoff, a loving father. Comedy, drama, film, TV, stand-up, he conquered them all and he made them his own. But he was tortured too, fighting alcoholism, drugs, and who knows what else in his way too short life, ultimately ended by suicide. It was an unfitting ending for a man who brought a nation much in need of laughter, years of laughter. He left us, we owing him, far more than what he sacrificed for us. Robin Williams had that certain something rarely found in comics today. He was funny, he was smart, he was serious, he was silly. His unique ability, not merely that he could tap into a wide range of emotions and take his audience to myriad places in the heart, but that where he took you, he went right along with you himself. I love the word pathos. Pathos is a word we rarely use today. Here is its definition. The quality or power in an actual life experience or in literature, music, speech, or other forms of expression of evoking a feeling of pity or of sympathetic and kindly sorrow or compassion. To be able to portray any of the aforementioned, you have to have a sympathetic nature, a kindly sorrow, and a compassion yourself. Few among us have them all. Williams did. Robin Williams was a man known for his uncanny ability at improvisation. True Mork from Mork was a series of improvisational bits, as were many of Williams' characters. But in fact, we learned from Dave Itzkoff's stunning biography, Robin, there was little improvisation in Robin's life. He studied the great comics beginning in his childhood, torturing himself in order to fill his gut with everything he needed to know to master the art he so loved, be it as a stand-up comic or a film and stage actor. That being said, it is clear that Robin Williams might never have become the great Robin Williams were it not for his inner soul. All you ever had to do to get a look into Williams' soul was to glance at his face. Robin Williams' face mirrored exactly who he was, a man who understood the human condition, a man of sympathetic nature with a kindly sorrow and a gargantuan gift of compassion. He made you laugh and could simultaneously tug at your heartstrings. Only the greats can do both at once. In a word, Robin Williams had pathos. I was thinking about Williams' great compassion, his pathos, as I read Itzkoff's biography, and I was wondering what Robin would think of the world as it is today, Trump's world, created only a few years after Robin left us. We are in dark times, when compassion and kindness are the purview of but a few, Trump in a short time having turned compassion and kindness into a relic of the past, and worse, something to be snickered at, as if compassion and kindness are somehow a weakness. I doubt Mrs-Doubtfire would understand the world according to Donald Trump, a world in which young, innocent immigrant children are wrenched from their mother's arms, locked in cages, and treated as nothing but shits for the dollars for Trump to build a ridiculous, useless wall to lock out a particular brand of humanity, usually brown in color, by a man who probably can't even spell the word compassion. Williams once said, and I quote, "Compassionate conservative? I don't know what that is. It sounds like a Volvo with a gun rack." Oh, how I wish Robin Williams was with us today. Robin was the great communicator. With his comic genius and his extraordinary acting ability, he took us all on a wild ride time and again. The thing about Robin was he would get us on his train, no Volvo Robin, and off together we'd go, only Robin knowing where the train ride would end. But in every ride, there was a lesson you hadn't realized you were being taught. Chief among his many lessons, he taught sympathy and compassion, a lesson too many could use a refresher course in today. Oh, Robin, that you were here today. All that pathos. We miss sympathy and compassion. We miss you, Robin. Thanks for the memories. Thank you so much for tuning in to Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec LLC. Be sure to tune in to Talkish Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, when new podcasts are posted at hallicasser-jayne.com and on all your favorite apps. We are open 24/7. So, until next time, when we meet again, this is Halli Casser-Jayne.